Okay, welcome back from lunch, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. So, if I haven't already met you, I'm Hannah Newell from the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be chairing this session. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Joseph Schear, who, as most of you know, hails from Christchurch College, Oxford, quite a mouthful, and he works on and publishes on quite a wide variety of topics, including phenomenology, German idealism, consciousness and philosophy of mind. And today his talk has changed a bit from the program. It's now entitled Sartre on Oneself and Others. So please welcome me to introduce, please join me in welcoming Joseph. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Anya, for organizing such a fantastic conference. You picked a theme that seems to have provoked such an incredible wide range of engagements. So Anya's kind invitation for this arrived just as I had agreed to give the Sartre lectures, the lectures on Sartre, in my department this year for the first time. And so in thinking about what to do for this, I decided that I would take the kind of marquee passage of the conference and try to dig into that a bit. I'll get the picture back on. And let me just say at the outset, I'm here to try to stick up for Sartre. Now, of course, I share the sense of fraudulency that Matthew Broom aptly noted yesterday, of coming into Paris and talking about Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. You can imagine my mortification when I walked into my hotel room to see this above my bed. But c'est la vie. And that's the end of my video presentation. You have a handout, and I'll just briefly give you the outline, which is on the front of your handout. I'm going to talk about the inhuman gaze objection, as I'm calling it, and defend Sartre from that objection by focusing on the sort of inaugural scene of the gaze, the shame scene. And I'm going to try to draw out some core features of the gaze as I understand it from that scene. And then I'm going to consider a new Merleau-Ponty inspired objection, the objection from primordial intersubjectivity, as I'm calling it, following Merleau-Ponty. And then I'm going to end by offering a kind of renewed case, sticking up for Sartre. Okay, so that's the plan. The first passage on the handout, I believe, it is said, says Merleau-Ponty, he doesn't dare name him, it is said that the other transforms me into an object and negates me, and that I transform the other into an object and negate him. But in fact, the other's gaze does not transform me into an object, and my gaze does not transform him into an object, unless both gazes draw back into the background of our thinking nature, unless we both establish an inhuman gaze, and unless each senses his actions not as taken up and understood, but rather as observed, like the actions of an insect. So Merleau-Ponty here claims that what is presented by Sartre as a kind of original condition, an original relation between self and other, in fact requires three exceptional and presumably optional conditions to be satisfied. The first is that we both withdraw into our thinking nature. The second, that we establish an inhuman gaze. And the third, which looks like it might be a specification of that first one, we sense the actions not as taken up and understood, but as observed. So my first question is this a convincing objection? And for it to be convincing, it's got to capture its target, does it? So let's turn to the shame scene, which at least half of you probably know by heart, but just to remind you, second passage on your handout. Let us imagine that moved by jealousy, curiosity, or vice, I have just glued my ear to the door and looked through the keyhole. I am alone on the level of non-static self-consciousness. Behind that door, a spectacle is presented as to be seen, the conversation, to be heard. My consciousness sticks to my acts. It is my acts, a pure mode of losing myself in the world, causing myself to be drunken by things. Jealousy is the possibility that I am. But all of a sudden I hear footsteps in the hall. Someone is looking at me. What does this mean? First of all, I now exist as myself for my unreflective consciousness. It is this eruption of self which has been most often described. So long as we consider the for itself in isolation, hitherto, we were able to maintain that the unreflective consciousness cannot be inhabited by a self. The self was given as object only for reflective self-consciousness. But here the self is given as object, comes to haunt the unreflective self-consciousness. Okay, so that's the inaugural scene of the gaze. And I want to now go back and consider the three conditions that Merleau-Ponty offers that he thinks are characteristic of the gaze. The first is withdrawing into one's thinking nature, particularly the position of the other. Here is the position of the witness, withdrawing into one's thinking nature. In the shame scene, we're told very little, of course, about the witness, and at some point later, Sartre tells us it could have just been the creaking floorboards, and the example would have worked. The threat is merely of someone, without any hint of the witness being a concerned party or just some stranger strolling by. But for the example to work, the fact that it doesn't require that the party be concerned, could indeed, for all that, be said to be a complete stranger, does not imply that the party draw back into their thinking nature. The witness, supposing there is a real witness, sees the voyeur, first of all, conscious rather than sort of emptily think of her. But moreover, the voyeur's shame embodies a consciousness of herself as up for evaluation by the witness. The witness is not only witness, but judge. Judging someone is a mode of interpersonal engagement, if there ever was one. So if by thinking nature is meant some kind of merely neutral apprehension, that's false to the scene. The idea that Sartrean intersubjectivity involves withdrawing into our thinking nature is, on the face of it, not terribly convincing. So let's take the second condition, namely this idea of establishing a human gaze. The jealousy and shame consuming the inaugural scene is, of course, an intensely human one. It's hard to conceive of what the sense of the inhuman could possibly be here. Of course, many have claimed that Sartre distorts the interhuman relation, and I'll get back to that in a second. But it can hardly be said that Sartre exits the whole problem of the interhuman relation, much less depicts the interhuman human relation as a kind of ongoing repudiation of the human. Sartre's scene is, in fact, a pretty nice illustration of what Christopher Peacock has recently called a scriptive interpersonal self-consciousness, which of course clogs the pen, but the basic idea is an awareness of oneself as being represented by another as a self-conscious subject, or as Sartre says, touched to the quick, characterizing the sense at work in the shame. And this is precisely a form of self-consciousness in relation to another that precludes the other construing one as an insect, assuming we're not in some sort of Kafka story or something. There's a third passage quickly on your handout where one of my graduate students who's working on Sartre and psychoanalysis and intersubjectivity reminded me of this passage late in the Concrete Relations with Others chapter, talking about sexual desire. This is Sartre, I desire a human being not as an insect or a mollusk, a more popular animal for him. I desire him or her as he is and as I am, and as he is another for me, and as I am another for him. Okay, so what about Merleau-Ponty's third condition, that each sense is taken up and understood, but as observed? Now, I've said that the insect business rings false to the scene, the highly interpersonal character of the scene. But focus more narrowly on this contrast between understanding versus observation. It's worth noting that the voyeur feels shame because he realizes, or at least he fears, that he has precisely been understood. The all-too-human jealousy consuming him is manifest to the other in his crouch as he's looking through the keyhole, hence his being touched to the quick. So here we have a robust meeting of minds, if you want. And on passage 7 of your handout, I could have one of those handouts as well. We have, yet by my very shame I claim as mine the dream of another. I affirm a profound unity of consciousnesses, not that of a harmony of monads. Okay, so on the face of it, none of Merleau-Ponty's three conditions seem to be satisfied, at least by the shame scene, the inaugural scene of the gaze. And it looks as if his objection does not meet its intended target. Now, appreciating the scene for what it is allows us to place the terms object and negate, or negation, in the original passage by Merleau-Ponty in the right light. So in the context of the original passage, it sounds like Merleau-Ponty is saying that the other negates me qua human and transforms me into something else, a mere object, suggesting that Sartre means mere object by object, and that by negate means transform me into something that I'm not. So if we look at the form of words that Sartre uses to give expression to the shame, he says, I am ashamed of myself before the other, to give expression to the voyeur's consciousness once it's been caught. So this is an unreflective consciousness of myself as object, mediated by the other. And here object does not mean material thing, like a table or an inkwell, but rather an embodied subject of experience and activity, a human being, a person, as the object of another's awareness. Oneself, a subject, in the eye of another, and hence oneself as object for another, the shared world. Now, negate. The relation to the other is what Sartre calls an internal negation. The other negates me, not by turning me into something that I'm not, but rather by distinguishing me from her. I am to her, her, not I, if you will, or a case of her, not I, because others can slide in. But so far, that notion of negation doesn't distinguish me from a garden variety intentional object, like a table for Sartre, because on his view, all intentional relations to objects is informed by a consciousness of the intentional object being not I, not me. But here in the intersubjectivity case, the relation is, as Sartre says, reciprocal. So for the other, I am the not I, and she is for me the not I, and we are aware of each other as such. And then the last core feature I want to bring out of the gaze as a form of relation to one another is the idea of an original relation. Now, Sartre, I think, means many things by that, but the sense I'm interested in for now, the reciprocity does not involve steps. It's not it's an original bilateral awareness. It's not that I'm aware of her and then aware of her as aware of me. Rather, I'm aware of her as aware of me. And moreover, I'm aware of her as aware of my crouching awareness. So passage 6 on your handout. The other does not appear to me as a being who is constituted first, so as to encounter me later. He appears as a being who arises in an original relation with me. Okay, so in sum, the gaze is an original pairing, a reciprocal internal negation, in Sartre's term, a manifestly human inter-human relation that in the shame scene at least is characterized by a profound unity of consciousnesses, as Sartre would say. The witness comes to see the voyeur accurately, and the gaze, the voyeur is acutely aware of himself as captured by the gaze. The idea that the gaze is an original bond need not be jumped, at least yet, for it's not conditioned by the features that Merleau-Ponty's passage suggests. Now, moving on to my third section, of course there's a sense of alienation, or at least a kind of distance, one wants to say, between self and other, at work in the gaze. After all, in the shame scene, it could be a complete stranger. And here, Merleau-Ponty and others would want to come back and offer an alternative picture. Insects aside, are there not more engaged and interactive, as we like to say, more intimate, one might say cozier, forms of intersubjectivity that are not captured by the pairing of looker and lookee introduced in the shame scene? Okay, so here it's worth introducing Merleau-Ponty's well-known biting scene, which I think has been mentioned by maybe Miriam History at one point. At any rate, the passage is on your handout. A 15-month-old baby opens his mouth when I playfully take one of his fingers in my mouth and pretend to bite it. His own mouth and teeth, such as he senses them from within, are immediately for him the instruments for biting. And my jaw, such as he sees it from the outside, is for him immediately capable of the same intentions. Biting immediately has an intersubjective signification for him. Okay, and then more recently, as is well known in developmental psychology, studies of infant imitation, they very much confirm that this mimetic responsiveness is on the scene much earlier than 15 months, and it's pervasive in a baby's life. The adult version of this, called it cozier form of intersubjectivity, you might think of as various kinds of contagion phenomena. So the wave of a football match, or mosh pits at music concerts perhaps. According to Matthew's presentation yesterday, young people in a psych ward participate in some sort of contagion practice as well. This kind of thing presumably is captured by Merleau-Ponty's phrase, anonymous collectivity. Now, the biting example was originally introduced, as you all know, in the context of attacking the idea of analogy as the way to capture or characterize our being onto one another. If, however, we hear the biting example, as many do, as a kind of counterexample to Sartre's account of the gaze, then we would be adopting what I call, it's on the handout, I believe, the reductive interpretation of Sartre's account. According to that interpretation, all forms of intersubjectivity are instances of the gaze. And one could cite a whole range of presumably plausible counterexamples to the reductive interpretation of the gaze. Dancing with someone, crew, which is an example Sartre himself mentions and associates with Heidegger, this sort of synchronized crewing, in a peak crew experience. Ordinary collaborative joint activities, such as you helping me carry a sofa from one side of the room to the other. Or even more intensely, Schear's grief scene, a kind of shared consciousness that runs even deeper, a feeling in common as you have the two parents before that child. Now, these are all putatively promising counterexamples to the reductive interpretation of the gaze. There's some textual evidence that Sartre endorses the reductive interpretation. I've given you just one on passage 5, where Sartre says, about halfway through the passage, he says, being seen by the other is a concrete daily relation, which at each instant I experience. At each instant, the other is looking at me. So you might think of that as the Langian interpretation of the gaze, or perhaps the Nicholas interpretation of the gaze, or the other is some sort of godlike figure at each instant looking. But I think the reductive interpretation, I'd be curious to see what you think, is not very plausible. It's hard to see how one would make the case for it. And it's mainly because it's far too susceptible to seeing a counterexample. So I think the better way to hear the biting example is not as a putative counterexample to the reductive interpretation of Sartre's account, but rather as a competing example that is put forward as an illustration of the basic case, a competing basic case, an alternative case of intersubjectivity. On this objection, Sartrean intersubjectivity, exemplified by the gaze, presupposes this primordial form of intersubjectivity, exemplified by the biting scene. This would be to appropriate the biting example as an objection to what I would call the priority interpretation of Sartre's doctrine of the gaze. According to the priority interpretation, without the structure introduced by the gaze, no other forms of intersubjectivity, however cozy, would be possible. So the thought here is that not all forms of intersubjective rapport are instances of the gaze. Rather, only subjects who are able to participate in the gaze relation are able to find themselves in other configurations of intersubjectivity that are themselves not instances of the gaze relation. If Merleau-Ponty is right that the biting case exemplifies a kind of original structure that is not dependent on the capacity to enter into the gaze relation, then Sartre can't be right that without the gaze, no other form of intersubjectivity is possible. Hence, the priority interpretation of Sartre's doctrine would be false. That's the objection from primordial intersubjectivity. Okay, so here I think we meet with at least two problems. This is me sticking up for Sartre. So the first problem is that often Merleau-Ponty sounds as if he's claiming a kind of developmental priority for this form of rapport with one another that one finds exemplified in the biting case. But of course here Sartre could just happily concede, as he should, that there are more primitive forms of embodied social rapport that help enable a sense of a shared world, stepping stones to an adult pure social world that is informed by the gaze. The developmental priority of, as Merleau-Ponty puts it at one point, the common ground and allegedly and peaceful, he doesn't say allegedly, peaceful coexistence in the world of childhood is fully compatible with it leading to something fundamentally different once the capacity for gaze relations are on the scene. And Sartre could even grant that at the biomechanical level, as it were, there could remain a kind of barbarous foundation of such primitive forms of social rapport. So here you might interpret Merleau-Ponty not as making a developmental claim, or as not only making a developmental claim, but also claiming that his case, the structure that his case is meant to illustrate, extends to the adult situation as well. And there are some Merleau-Ponty commentators that precisely take this line, in effect claiming that we all, as adults, as it were, live in this open, mimetic world of childhood. But then there's a real question here about whether the biting case or the adult contagion analogs are cases of genuine intersubjectivity at all. Genuinely being with, much less for, others requires some acknowledgement of the other as an independent person. And it's no coincidence that Merleau-Ponty repeatedly likened the self's relation to the other as akin to one limb's reversible relation to another within a single lived body. A late passage mirrors through an extension of that co-presence of the two hands. He and I, like organs of one single intercorporeality. So, as I think Sean said yesterday, the worry is that intercorporeality is not intersubjectivity, insofar as it doesn't acknowledge the independent perspective that the other brings to bear on the relation. So the worry about the objection from primordial intersubjectivity is that this kind of mimetic meshing, either in the form of infant imitation or in the form of adult contagion practices, does not satisfy what one might call the alterity constraint. How then does the gaze provide for the sense of otherness? The gaze, Sartre says, is the fundamental connection, there you get this priority claim, the fundamental connection which must form the basis of any theory of the other. So what does it mean to be onto someone as genuinely other than oneself? Okay, so take the passage 8 on your handout. Am I okay on time? And I don't want to go through the whole thing, but I want to focus on the bit that I've italicized and underlined in the middle. The sentence, I grasp the other's look or gaze at the very center of my act, as the solidification and alienation of my own possibilities. Okay. So it's important first to recognize that given this sort of widespread sense of a troubling distance or even paranoia in the Sartrean picture of intersubjectivity, the alienation that he mostly talks about, and certainly talks about in this passage, has to do with the self's relationship to itself, and not the self's relationship to the other. Of course, it's provoked by the encounter with the other. So I want to sketch 3 different ways to hear alienation. What I'll call the epistemic sense of alienation. The second one I'll call the ontological sense of alienation, and then a third one, which I think stands a chance of being true, the existential sense of alienation. Okay, so the epistemic sense. This is the idea, quite crudely, that the other's look represents an alienation of my possibilities because the other can never truly know what I'm up to in some piece of expressive conduct. And more importantly, I can never truly know what he takes me to be up to. There's a mention of the other being unknowable to the other earlier on in the passage, in passage 8, which I won't read, which suggests that there might be something like this epistemic alienation from the other, a sense of alienation familiar from the traditional problem of other minds. But that's clearly a bad reading, at least of Sartre. For him, my mindedness is not hidden within me, and ipso facto unavailable to a foreign subjectivity outside of me. Sartre clearly thinks that our bodies and gestures are expressive of mind and directly pick-upable, perceivable by others. So the epistemic reading of alienation is a false path. But consider the ontological notion of alienation, which on the face of it rings a lot truer to things that Sartre says in this passage and elsewhere. Here the thought is that the other treats me, as he says in the passage at one point, as having a nature, and thereby distorting me as a for itself being. So the other, by doing this, alienates me from myself, precisely because I'm not the kind of thing that has a nature or a fixed identity in Sartre's view of the for itself mode of being. Insofar as the other is treating me as such, his gaze embodies a kind of ontological mistake, you might say. Ontological alienation is obviously a deeper form of alienation than epistemic alienation. Epistemic alienation has to do with the sense of not knowing how I'm taken by the other, and thereby presupposes that the other apprehends me as a for itself being, a locus of freedom and mindedness, to be interpreted in the first place. Ontological alienation is a sense of oneself as categorically misinterpreted by the other, as not truly a for itself being at all, as if turned into stone by the look of Medusa, a myth that Sartre himself mentions later in the chapter. Okay, so while this rings truer to some of the passages, there are at least two problems with this interpretation. Now, first of all, it seems to flout a key feature, an original, or an originary key feature of the look that I mentioned at the outset, namely that it's a reciprocal internal negation. I am conscious of the other as distinguishing me from herself, and she is conscious of me as doing the same thing back, distinguishing her from myself. This reciprocal internal negation requires that she already grasp me as a for itself being. But then second, why would I accept this ontological misinterpretation of the other, which would presumably be a condition on finding myself alienated from myself thanks to that misinterpretation? After all, I'm firmly aware of myself as a for itself kind of being on Sartre's view, and at the end of this passage, in passage 8, he re-announces that firm self-recognition. I am conscious of the, insofar as I have that self-recognition, whatever the sense of alienation is, it has to be compatible with that recognition. And since the ontological reading, the Medusa reading, if you will, doesn't seem consistent with that self-recognition, it's wanting. So if not the epistemic sense of alienation, if not the ontological sense of alienation, the Medusa view, how are we to hear the sense of alienation and solidification? So here's my current hypothesis. It's terribly hot in here, I'm almost done. The sense of alienation brought out in the encounter with the other arises out of the bare idea that via the gaze, I am conscious of the other as having an independent perspective on me. And so, in some sense, a say about me, we might say. So this introduces what I'll call an existential sense of alienation or self-estrangement that I otherwise, the thought is, wouldn't have. The other, embodied in the gaze, harbors an interpretation or reading of my contact of my conduct, and that interpretation or reading could be in the form of an immediate reactive attitude. And it's not that this reading is unknowable. That's the bad epistemic interpretation. And it might be utterly manifest to me in the case of an obvious reactive attitude. And if it's not obvious, then she can just tell it to me. And it's not that the reading or interpretation or the uptake of me is an ontological mistake, turning me into stone. That's barely coherent for the reasons that I was suggesting earlier. Rather, my conduct is given to her, takes on the shape of something there. It has an outsideness, as Sartre at one point says, available to be read by her and reacted to. The reading of my conduct, and so me, is ultimately up to her to form and hold, and not up to me. Now, the other's reaction or reading of my conduct can be instructive for me. The other can open up a self-understanding for me that I wouldn't have otherwise had. The other can teach me about myself, as Sartre himself says at one point. But this would depend upon my appropriating it from her. And so even in this good case, you might say, there's the sense of alienation or self-estrangement isn't effaced, but rather confirmed. It's there, however momentarily, in the other person's relation to me, in the fact of the other person introducing that kind of relation to myself that I otherwise wouldn't have had. He says at one point, Sartre on passage 9, I am responsible for my being for others, but I am not the foundation of it. So the witness in the shame scene could write me off, could crouch alongside me and take turns peeping, and then later blame me for his lapse. Regardless, my conduct is now caught up in the other's ongoing interpretation of me, and that is an indeterminate and unpredictable affair. It may even not be predictable for the other person, but regardless, it's ultimately her business, not something it's something that she must come to, not me. And who ultimately thinks what, and how exactly my comportment in the situation is to be read as a kind of reflection of me, these are up for grabs. And my take and the other's take can always come apart. And there may be nothing that I can do about that. So the alienation from oneself here is built into the asymmetry of the self-other relation as such. Okay, so let me close now by returning to Sartre's thesis that the gaze is the basic form of intersubjectivity. It's not developmentally basic. And I haven't studied it, but we can safely assume it's not developmentally basic. And Sartre is not saying, as I read him, that any and all configurations of intersubjectivity are in fact instances of the gaze. Rather, the form of our relation to one another at work in the gaze is original or basic, because you can't understand other configurations of intersubjectivity without understanding the gaze in the background. This is because the gaze provides for the idea of a plurality of subjects, independent of one another and aware of each other as such, which is required by the very idea of being for, or indeed with, others. And this independence from one another essentially introduces, again, often only in the background, the fraught and uneasy dynamic of being for others, vulnerable to one another's readings, without which any form of human intersubjectivity would not be recognizable. Now, that's how I read the basic thesis. It's a big claim to try to make good on, and I haven't done that today. My main aim today has been to put the claim on the table for a hearing, and I appreciate your listening.
Okay, I apologize if I don't know all your names, but put your head up quite high so you can't see so well. Want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, I thought that was great. I just wanted to ask a bit more about what you take to be like the status of Sartre's terms. So, I mean, you kind of presented this as offering like the necessary conditions, what has to be the case in order for intersubjectivity to be possible. And I wonder if there might not be like this kind of, I think, maybe an alternative way of taking Sartre, where he's a bit less ambitious. That it's kind of restricted to the nature of human subjectivity. I think about human is sort of happy to basically accept most of what you've said. But I'm a bit reluctant to accept the idea that all possible forms of intersubjectivity, I mean, I guess it depends on how that's understood, but all possible forms require the gaze, right? So I mean, I was trying to think of an example, but I was maybe like some kind of like intelligent insect life form, right? And they have this kind of amorphous awareness of like a we or an us, and maybe that's somehow prior to the differentiation of individuals, or maybe it's interdependent somehow. I was wondering if you thought that really started to make this
Yeah.
ambitious plan.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just gonna. The windows used to be open, and then they closed. Was that because of noise? Oh, the air. I see.
You're sweating because you're under the gun.
It may be the altitude. It's a combination. Yeah. So, what I thought you were going to say. Let me first respond to what I thought you were going to say, and then I'll respond to what you said. So I thought you were going to say, on my handout, I offer a kind of sketch of an argument. And the second premise is that the gaze provides for awareness of interdependence. And when you first said necessary, I thought you were going to say the gaze might be provides for is sufficiently non-committal that it could be read as sufficient for independence without being necessary. I'll wait for someone else to ask that question. With respect to your question, yeah. So I didn't really intend to say anything beyond the human. Sartre asked exegetically. It's a very interesting question actually, because I had always read Sartre as kind of just interested in the human case, but there's a moment in this stretch of the text, part 3, where he countenances the idea of being for itself that is not for others, actually. And so I've always read this book as, that the full picture is being for itself for others, and that the for others section is not an addition to an in-place picture that just gets enriched, but that rather it's a development of the original picture, such that you don't understand the initial case about being for itself, independent of what eventually gets added. But in that passage that I just mentioned, one says that one can countenance a being for itself that is not for others, and he says that not for the human, suggesting that his metaphysics is larger than the human. Now, we knew it was larger than the human in the sense that the in itself mode of being is not limited to the human, but the in itself mode of being is essentially indexed on his view to the for itself mode of being. So in that broader sense, it's a human metaphysics, as it were. So yeah, I don't think he would be against. On my view of him, he wouldn't be against that sort of case. It's there are hard methodological issues which I didn't come close to raising about how it is that one demonstrates these kinds of necessities in the human case. How it is that phenomenological demonstration can deliver the results that it has always promised. Once, especially when we move beyond the string of Wissenschaft of its opening, and more towards the existential human problematic in Sartre and Heidegger and Neuromancy. I'm going to put that question to the side.
Sure. Thank you so much for bringing up. I really enjoyed that. The question is, what do you think about crowdsourcing? When people use their cell phones to crowdsourcing. Yeah. People use their cell phones in revolutions or rebellion and they actually, they're all of them are kind of we,
Yeah.
a revolutionary we, but
Yeah.
then they use that cell phones and they become their own subjects, and those people who are being filmed are objects of revolution. So it's kind of otherizing or just making you the you, but the others and the other as being objects. So I see a line within that, kind of borderline, when you are a revolutionary we, and then we're authorized by crowdsourcing cell phones.
Sorry,
and the
so
question is,
what's the line? The line, what's on both sides of the line?
On the one side is the one who's just holding the cell phone and is the subject of filming, and the other one who is just being filmed is the object of being filmed. So, in one way, we're just objectifying that kind of other subject, but we are subjects ourselves. So it's kind of making the other one the other, because it's not I, and at the same time, it's not I, because I'm feeling that one, it
Right.
becomes the object.
Right.
So it's kind of intersubjectivity. So we have a kind of reciprocity, but it's not really intersubjectivity. It's, one can feel, as you said, the corporeality, because we can see that they're different from this object of sourcing. Because the cell phone is not me, it's not my hand.
I'm sorry, so I thought you were talking about the relation between me, who's doing the filming, and the person that I'm filming.
Yeah, in crowdsourcing, in revolutionary, in
Yeah,
rebellion.
okay, good. But do you now want to bring in the question of the relation between me and the cell phone?
No, I want to know if it is intersubjectivity
Yeah, I would say-
or incorporeality.
I think it's intersubjectivity.
So,
It's Sartrean, it's a slightly impoverished case,
uh-huh.
especially given the kind of concrete relations that one finds in chapter 3 of part 3 of Being Nothingness, that are a bit more fraught. But yeah, that would be a perfectly good case. You can come up to me and take that away, or you can start filming me.
in the beginning, we are all we, revolutionary we.
I see. Good. So, all right. So let's focus on that. Yeah. So that's cases of what you might call anonymous collectivity, where there's a set. I take it your thought is there's a sense of togetherness, where you're not
It's a kind
actually
of crowd.
picking out particular people and engaging with them. So it's a sense of sociality, but not straightforwardly intersubjective.
Okay.
Right? Is that a fair characterization? That's also the case in the, at the sports match when everyone does the wave, or mosh pit type participation. I like to call practices of contagion,
Okay.
and sometimes they can have a kind of collective purpose in this case, whereas a lot of the practices of contagion in entertainment would be used to entertain ourselves, to give ourselves a break from real intersubjectivity, as it were. Yeah, so one way to hear that case is just, so the Sartrean claim would be, as I presented it, that those cases are not instances of intersubjectivity, as he understands it, but that they presuppose the capacity to enter into gaze relations. So no one who enjoys those forms of anonymous collectivity as mature adults could do so without being capable, without being able to enter into intersubjective relations. That's how I hear Sartre's claim. And I think it's plausible, but I didn't defend it, really, as much as I wanted.
My point is that the intervention of that digital cell phone makes that borderline and that boundary between me as a revolutionary subject and the other one who's being filmed as the object. So at the beginning, we're not subject and object. At the beginning, we're all revolutionary subjects. But with that intervention of cell phone, when I'm crowdsourcing, well, I become the subject, and the other becomes the other, which is the object.
Right.
I think we'll have to move on just so I get to everyone on the list, but maybe we can continue
But
with
yeah,
some of our
I think I see your point now. Just really quick, like in 2001, I guess it was, I was in Berlin when it was, 800,000 or more on the streets against the Iraq war, and we were all part of this. You know, it was really many. I was surrounded by like 70 and 80-year-olds. I mean, it was across. It was the sense of collective political ethos was quite live, given my generation. And you can imagine sort of being a part of that, and then all of a sudden you see someone going like this, right? That's your thought. Like, that's what, you know. Are you with us, or are you part of the enemy? Yeah. So I think that I don't know how that's an objection to me. That seems like a perfectly interesting case.
I'm not sure it's intersubjectivity, but anyway.
When the person goes like that, oh yeah, they're a threat. There's a reason they're threatening. You apprehend them as a for itself thing.
It's not
Okay,
reciprocity.
sorry, we're going to have to move on. Yeah?
Sure, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. I think I agree with basically everything you said, and I'm very much in favor of highlighting the importance of dyadic relations if we want to understand intersubjectivity. My only question concerns the notion of gaze. So here's one worry. Isn't it too visual? And what about touch? What about talking with each other on the phone? Wouldn't that be able to replicate many of the structures you're interested in? And secondly, Irving Strauss once made this comment vis-a-vis Sartre's discussion of the gaze, that there's a huge difference between the gaze of the voyeur and the gaze of the lover. So I mean, the question is just, isn't what we want to get at with dyadic relation rather than specifically the gaze?
Yeah. So first question, I don't think it has to be limited to the visual at all. Certainly in the conversational, it's quite clear how it can be intentional. And in touch as well. So the gaze of the lover is a topic of Sartre himself. So it's not as if a very understandable reaction to the kind of dialectic I set up was, you've got kind of the mimetic meshing picture that one sometimes finds, at least in Merleau-Ponty, not always. And then you've got the seemingly oppositional, confrontational pose at work in the gaze. And okay, but what? There's everybody loves mutual recognition now. So, what about Sean, in a different context, mentioned the gaze of the lover last night. Is that it's not an instance of the gaze as I was construing it, but the claim would be that in order to that the gaze of the lover, a subject-subject relation, we call it, one has to be able to suffer or participate in the self-other asymmetry that's at work in the gaze. Now, Sartre's own reading of the project of love is quite cynical, but that's not necessarily built into it. Basically, he thinks of the project of love as a kind of reaction to the original structure of self-other asymmetry. And I haven't thought enough about that to know what it doesn't sound great, but maybe he's right. I don't know.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
James. I had two quick questions. The first one is just very clarificatory. I didn't understand what you meant as when you said the social. What's the word for it? Sorry. Social contagion was the adult version of the mimicry example, or the biting example.
Yeah.
I mean, just the way I'm coming at it, that doesn't. I don't understand how they're structurally similar at all.
Right.
That's the first question. And the second question is more general. My inclination is to agree with Merleau-Ponty's criticism because, the problem, as I understand it, he was seeing with Sartre is that there's this very negative account that the engagement with the other limits me, it objectifies me, it sort of deprives me of my for itself freedom. But
I tried to disabuse us of that reading.
Well, right, but Sartre still uses that language, right?
Yeah, and he's just being dramatic.
But I think so. Yeah, he's.
He does that. You have to admit. I mean, he's a kind of hysterical writer sometimes.
Yeah, but it's quite fundamental to a lot of things he writes about this objectification as a way of depriving the freedom of the other. But I think, I mean, if you're going back to also,
So I just think it's up for grabs how we read that. So I offered the ontological alienation, the myth of Medusa version of the self-other relation. That's quite common. That I take it you just enunciated, and I don't think it makes sense as a good interpretation of what Sartre means in light of other things he says. So what you take to be an obvious interpretation of Sartre, I just disagree with.
well, fair enough, but I still think even the existential one is focusing strictly on the negation aspect of it. So I think
Well,
what
as
Merleau-Ponty
I
wants to-
mentioned at one point, I mean, someone else can open up a self-understanding for you that you otherwise wouldn't have, and that oftentimes will depend upon a long relationship, though not necessarily. And so there are good cases of self-other asymmetry, as it were. But even there, the sense of alienation that I was interested in trying to pin down is at work. It's within the context of a good case, where the other teaches me about myself. But nonetheless, there's the moment of self-estrangement, which has to be appropriated by the other. And that's the existential alienation. Now, that's not a bad thing in human life. And Sartre oftentimes sounds as if he's hell is other people, as it's famously said. But I just think that's a bad reading.
Okay, so hopefully we can continue this interesting conversation during the break, but that's all the time we have right
Thanks
now.
for the question.
Sorry.